Yalimadad and hello, and thank you for joining us on a Sunday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Heena Jiwani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all speaking from the ancestral lands of the Wichita and Caddo-affiliated tribes in the Dallas area. Each of us on this call today are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treated and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are a part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands, and are working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we're talking about knowing one another, exploring racial inequalities, and today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore intersectionality through the marginalization of race, the histories of race, caste, and class inequities, and how these inequities are perpetuated through policies and systems. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We'll try to address as many as we can today, but of course, we all know that time is of the essence as well, so we will do our best. With that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists briefly. Dr. Yasmin Jiwani is a full professor in the Department of Communication Studies and a Concordia University Research Chair on Intersectionality, Violence, and Resistance. Her research interests focus on the discursive ways in which racist sexism is conceptualized and ideologically utilized in popular discourse. The particular sites which she has examined include media reportage of violence against Indigenous and racialized immigrant women, representations of Indigenous and Muslim youth in the popular press, as well as discourses of resistance articulated by marginalized groups in film and other popular media. Her most recent project is centered on cyber memorials and virtual graveyards as reflections of the vernacular. Here, her analysis attends to race, gender, and belonging as expressed in the narratives posted in on these sites. She is the author of Discourses of Denial, Race, Gender, and Violence, and co-editor of Girlhood, Redefining the Limits, and Faces of Violence in the Lives of Girls. Dr. Shaista Patel identifies as a Pakistani Muslim feminist scholar and works as the assistant professor of critical Muslim studies at UCSD. In her scholarly and other political work, she asks questions situated at the intersections of race, caste, gender, sexuality, class, and multiple colonialisms. Again, I'd like to welcome both of you. Shaista, Yasmin, it's wonderful to have such brilliant scholars with us today, and clearly this topic is your area of expertise. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. So now let's actually turn to the conversation, Shaista and Yasmin. So as we begin this conversation, we'd like to first get an understanding of the concepts of intersectionality as it pertains to race, caste, class. So we all know these words and these buzzwords sometimes, but if you could actually help us to understand these concepts and elaborate on sort of the historical underpinnings found in these inequities.
Okay, intersectionality has really become a buzzword. Everybody is intersectional. That's the reality. So if we think about intersectionality, what does it actually mean? Well, it means that basically, if you were to take your own position into account in terms of race, gender, class, sexuality, age, religion, everybody is different. But we have to go back to where intersectionality came from and how it emerged to truly understand and embrace what it has to offer for us. And this is where we go back to its roots in Black feminist thought. because intersectionality came out in a way as a response to the kind of essentialism that was there in the feminist movement. It was an argument to say not all women are the same, and not all women are positioned in a way that they can take advantage of the system or have the same access to penalties and privileges that different women have, depending on their class, depending on their race, depending on their location even. So we have to go back to intersectionality if we don't want to use it in a way that it's being used and bandied about, which is in a very sort of depoliticized way, and a way that's quite inauthentic, then I think we need to go back to its roots and say, okay, where did this come from? And where and how did it emerge? So if it emerged as a way to take back the power, as a form of empowerment, to say, hey, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean to say that I'm treated the same way that you are. Then, and this clearly goes all the way back to 100 years ago or more, where you have women, Black women, saying that very thing. Then it's like saying, well, you need to take into account that the very construction, the very identity woman depends for its meaning on where it's positioned in the axis of power. So intersectionality is about that. And why is intersectionality so important? Well, if we are to recognize the relativity or the places in which we are located, we are better able to identify the shared experiences of oppression and build alliances. And this becomes very important. I want to give you a really interesting example that was talked about. There's a book called Love in the Foxhole. And in that, one of the members of the Black Lives Matter movement, youth movement, talks about going to Palestine and making links with the Palestinian youth and how they learned from each other how to avoid those, the particular kind of armaments that are being used against them, whether it's smoke, whether it's and bullets, rubber bullets, and stuff like that. It was that kind of alliances coming out of that shared grounding in the commonality of a shared oppression, not necessarily from the same people, but the location of that. So intersectionality really brings that. It has this potential for us to develop those alliances, which I think are very, very important, particularly today, where there is a lot of division and a lot of sort of enmity between different groups, even though they might have shared experiences. At the same time, intersectionality also allows us to embrace the individual, the kind of sort of like uniqueness of our position. So it allows us to understand, for instance, that, okay, having grown up in East Africa as an Ismaili, I have a very different set of experiences and maybe even a different interpretation than, for instance, my counterpart who may be growing up in Pakistan. My experience as an East African Ismaili is different from a Pakistani Ismaili, and it depends on where I am. So the location becomes another criteria. If I'm in Pakistan, I'll be treated differently. If I'm in the US, I will be treated differently. And in each place, it's my interpretation of it. So that's another place where intersectionality comes in. We have to, I strongly believe that when we go back to the roots of intersectionality, we can actually appreciate it as a theory of power. It's an analytic that allows us to see how, in fact, the matrices of power that are there in society really not only shape who we are, but also how we are hailed, how we are called upon, how we are seen. So if we look at intersectionality, say from the post 9/11 framework, then we would see, for instance, that all brown bodies are being treated in a different way, whether you're Sikh, whether you're Muslim. It was the Sikhs that were also targeted and also assaulted, right, with violence committed against them because they were brown bodies, but they are differently situated. It's like a Brahmin is very differently situated than a Muslim. So we have to look at intersectionality that way. And my favorite example, which is something that I credit my sister with, is when this whole, when the Biden inauguration happened, I got a call from one of the reporters who asked me, how did I, as a Canadian brown person, feel about Kamala Harris? And I wanted to say, just because she's brown doesn't mean to say she's the same as me. Okay, they're very different things. So just because someone is brown, like a Priti Patel in the UK, doesn't mean to say they share the same politics as I do. So class, age, location, sexuality, all of those things come in. Histories of migration come in to shape who one is. So we have to look at intersectionality as this kind of a tactic against race essentialization. I am not the same as all brown people, but at the same time, we have to embrace what Gayatri Spivak talks about, a kind of essentialist, a strategic essentialism, which is to say, I'm not the same as all brown people, but I have certain shared experiences with other brown people in terms of exclusions, right? And that's where it comes from. So I'm going to stop there and let Shaista come in and add a few words.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jiwani, for that. I want to begin with saying Yali Madad, Assalamu alaikum. I am speaking from city we know as San Diego, but this is the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay people, who are our university actually is literally situated on the bones of indigenous peoples. There were bones buried, there were graves of indigenous peoples, Kumeyaay peoples, that were found underneath our chancellor's home. And there was this whole issue that ensued after that about like how to study them. They wouldn't repatriate them back to the community. So the violences and the acknowledgements are really literally grounded in ongoing realities of colonial violence here. I also want to say thank you to Farhana and Heena, for inviting me to be part of this. I'm just so happy and so glad that these conversations are happening as part of critical conversations. I know that growing up in 1990s and 2000s when I was, young, these conversations weren't happening, and we did not know how to identify ourselves as Ismailis in the particular ways that we now understand. So thank you so much to ITREB for organizing these sessions. I also want to say to Dr. Yasmin Jiwani, who I met many years ago as a young graduate student who had no idea what she was saying, you were so kind to me. And I mean, I'll always remember kindness because kindness is so rare in our business, in academia. And so that was so pedagogic for me in how I began to orient myself towards my students. So thank you so much, Dr. Jiwani, for teaching me that. Thank you. I'm going to talk more about caste, and I will share my screen. Dr. Jiwani has already, given us this whole sort of like the 101 and beyond the 101 on intersectionality. But I do want to say, especially for young people who are here, who are thinking more about intersectionality, who are thinking more about abolition, who are thinking about the politics of decolonization, that, read Black scholars, read Indigenous scholars, and I would say read Dalit scholars, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I was just reminded of this thing, I was writing down some quick notes last night, and, because of pandemic memory, I forget everything. So I just took down some notes. This quote by Audre Lorde that is circulated quite a bit, where she says, late Black scholar, theorist, poet, Audre Lorde, teacher, who says there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, right? The issues are multiple. And so to think about how is it that you are placed in these systems of oppressions and dominations and subordination, what are your particular complicities, whether situational or willful, that is really important political work. So with that, Hina, is it okay if I begin to talk about caste and share that image that I had? Okay, so I'm going to share an image from, an image with you all as I talk about what caste is. It's shared, I think, right? Okay, so what you see here is, is a pyramid, which is necessarily the caste hierarchy casteism, caste hierarchy, caste apartheids. These are words which you will hear today. So just to begin with, what is caste, right? We have an understanding of race, we know class, gender, sexuality, some conversations that are happening, within these conversations as well. But what is caste and why should we care as a Smiley? So I'll talk first about what is caste and then talk about why we should be invested in working against caste and caste hierarchies, right? Just like there can be no racism without race, no race without racism, there can be no caste outside of caste apartheid and violence, caste hierarchy and casteist violence. So very, the conversations are very complex, but that doesn't mean that we cannot begin to engage with them in, on grounds, along the lines in which we can begin to understand, especially coming from a race framework, right? So caste is a structure of hierarchy, just like race is. It is a system of oppression and actually one of the oldest systems of oppression, right? Like we can begin to track the work of race, let's say in 1492, 1441, right, when Portuguese started to enslave Black people, or we can take it to Spain, and talk about how Muslims were constructed as particular kinds of racialized bodies by Christians, so eating with your hands, sitting on the floor, eating couscous, putting henna like mendi on your hands. All of these were seen as using bathhouses. Europeans did not like to bathe, and Muslims did. And so, even that was seen as a sign of there being otherwise, right? And so you can also begin to think of race there. And of course, Black people have been constructed as, evil, as sinful, and painted with purple ink since as far as 5th century. And I'm sure actually that's older, right? So anyways, but it is in all of this, with all of this knowledge, that I'm saying that caste hierarchies are at least 2,000 years old. Many people have said 4,000. There's a whole history of conquest of India, which places it, at least at 4,000 years old. So there's that as well. But I will work with 2,000 because that's something that I've been able to track in my own work. So caste, again, is a structure of hierarchy, just like races. It is a system of oppression. It affects, and a conservative rate of calculation, right? The conservative rate is over 1 billion people around the world today, 1 billion people, right? It was codified as a system and practice of oppression according to Manusmriti. Manusmriti is, there's lots of work on Manusmriti. Now there's English translation of Manusmriti as well, but Manusmriti in very plain terms is Hindu scripture, is ancient Hindu scripture written by Manu. Manu was the author, that's why Manusmriti. And so what Manusmriti did is that it codified the system of caste, right? So it gave people the language. There was no such thing as Hindu. First of all, Hindu is a colonial category, right? So when we say Hindu, we necessarily mean Brahmins, though I'm not saying that, other people, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, Dalits can also not identify as Hindu, but I'm just saying that overall, the basic understanding was that it was Brahmins, okay? So the idea is, this pyramid, to quickly explain this, the idea is that, Lord Brahma, God Brahma, the God of Brahmins, these people that we all were created from his body parts, right? So to begin with, the idea that Brahma constructed or created, gave birth to Brahmins from his mouth. So they came from his mouth. Brahmins are priests. They are caretakers of and keepers of scriptural knowledge. They are legislators. And in today's world, in North America, in the US, in Canada, often scholars that you read as South Asian are Brahmins because there is a Brahmin supremacy in academia, okay? So that's, so they are, pundits and professors and all of that. The second one then is, Manusmriti advances this idea that Kshatriya, the second, on the second tier, Kshatriyas came from Brahma's shoulders, right? So shoulders as in, strength. So they're powerful. They are the warriors. They are the warlords. They were the kings. So priests and kings. And then Brahma gave birth to Vaishyas, which is the third one, from his thighs. So this is the merchant class. And, for context, as a Pakistani, I know that Qaeda-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was also Khoja, was from the merchant class. Many Ismailis are from merchant class, people who converted in 14th century. So So there's that. And then the last one is this idea that Brahma gave birth to Shudras, or the Bahujans, from his feet, right? So they are the lowest at the caste level. Shudras are also called Bahujans. They are the low caste people. And I would suggest that instead of using low caste, we use words such as lowered caste, because this is not on Shudras that they are low caste. They are made into lowered caste people. Now, outside of this pyramid, outside of the caste system, are the Dalits and Adivasis. Adivasis are indigenous peoples of India. Well, I would say of South Asia, but there are very particular kinds of differences between Adivasis in India and in Pakistan. Those are the two contexts that I know. So, but outside of that are Dalits, who used to be called Achut as in untouchables, right? So these are people who could not touch your food. These are people who could not walk like within like a few feet of Brahmin, lest their shadow pollute the shadow of the Brahmin. So, I mean, that's how serious it was. Dalit women, for the longest part, could not cover their upper bodies, only, especially in front of Brahmins, men and women, because, there was this idea that certain kinds of clothing, such as sari blouses, were only for people with caste. So Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, right? So the violences were despicable. The violence were severe. And then came this revolutionary figure in Dalit history called Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, and he has done brilliant work. His wife Savitribai Phule. So often Dalits say, the beginning of a session or ceremony or an event, they would say Jai Bhim, which is B.R. Ambedkar, and they would say Jai Savitri. I often say Jai Savitri as well, to acknowledge that these are these are important figures in Dalit history. So in 1880s, Phule came with this word Dalit, which is a Marathi word which means crushed down, right? So these are people who've been crushed down, but they say they're still reclaiming some of that power, because names are important, labels are important. And they're saying that we refuse to be called Achut or Harijan, as Gandhi used to call them, which is another really violent thing to do. And they claim the word Dalit for themselves. So Dalit means crushed down. It's a Marathi word. But I want to say, and there's so much that I do want to say, and I'll try to speak a little bit more quickly, and then I promise I'll stop after that. But Dalits are not only found in Hinduism. This is a myth that that all Dalits are Hindus. That is not the case. In the case of Pakistan, for example, Dalits identify as indigenous peoples of Pakistan. They're neither Hindu nor Muslims nor Christians, and so they're made into Hindus for particular reasons. But caste has been part of Ismailism too, and this is why today I brought up this, this discussion. This is why we decided that it is important for us to talk about caste and Ismailism. Caste has been a part of Ismailism too, and I'm not saying that casteist violence is, but what I'm saying is that there was a direct confrontation and challenge to caste by our peers, and that is a history that I'm very, very slowly beginning to become aware of, right? Because it's not necessarily taught to us, right, anywhere. So, one of the examples that I can think of very quickly is this example of Guptis. Gupti comes from Gupta, which means hidden, people who are not who do not reveal themselves. Gupti Ismailis did not reveal themselves as Ismailis to people of their caste. These were mostly upper caste people who had converted to Shia Ismailism at the hands of our peers, various peers, but they continue to practice Hinduism on the outside, right? So they wouldn't circumcise their boys. They read shlokas at their weddings, like the chants at the Hindu Brahmin chants at their weddings. They did Saat Phera, right? They burnt their dead, right? Which is a very Hindu practice, because Ismailis we and Muslims we bury our dead. And but alongside that, they recited dua, they knew their ganans, they offered nazrana, they were in touch with, various people who would carry their messages to the imam and vice versa. So these were I'm going to stop my my screen share. Yeah. So these are people. Heena, can I take one more minute, or am I going over?
Please do. I think it's going to tie in well to the next kind of question that comes in my mind as you both have sort of spoken. So please finish your thought.
Okay. Okay, so these are Ismailis, right? Guptis who are mostly Brahmins of a particular caste, and so they hid their Ismaili identity. So here's what's important to know, right? That um, even though even though Brahmins were very complicit in violence against Bahujans, Shudras, against Dalits, it didn't mean that they always retained that caste privilege, right? When Brahmins converted to Shia Ismailism, when Brahmins converted to Islam, they lost that caste privilege. A prominent example, and there's so many examples, but a prominent example that I can think of is Pakistani national poet Muhammad Iqbal, right, who we know as Allama Iqbal, or at least the Pakistanis at least people of my generation and older would know as, Allama Iqbal. So Allama Iqbal's family was Kashmiri Pandit. They're Kashmiri Brahmins. This is before Iqbal was born. They were Kashmiri Pandits. They were Kashmiri Brahmins. And when they converted to Islam, so there's this thing, this thing that hukka pani band hona, which means that, their access to water and food were cut off, and they were necessarily evicted from Kashmir. So they moved to Sialkot, Punjab, where Iqbal was born, right, like 2 generations down the road. And so just to give an example, that the fear was real for these Ismailis, for these Guptis to hide their caste identity. But one important thing also that I want to say is that and there's this whole history of Arya Samaj as well, and the violences that they committed against Ismailis who were Brahmins once they converted. But one of the things that I want to say is that I really want to say is that Khoja, which is seen as a particular caste, which is seen as a traitor caste, not all Khojas not all Khojas were dominant caste, right? So there are Dalits and Bahujans who converted to Ismailism, and in the making of Khoja as a particular kind of category that then began to be circulated as caste categories, what were the erasures that happened? This is a question that I hope young people on this, or other Ismaili scholars, would take up and research. And so that's one thing that I wanted to say. I also want to say that many of the answers to caste, to anti-casteism, right, like fighting against caste, we find in our Ginans. This is not my expertise, so I won't go into a lot. But Ginans are rich devotional texts in which you can also track the work of casteism. So our peers, for example, right, our peers, Peer Sadruddin, for example, drew from popular Bahujan poets and saints who represent, this is in 14th century, right? So medieval India. And these poets and saints who represented powerful anti-caste and anti-ritual nature of Brahmanism, right? So anti-caste, anti-ritual. So they took those vocabularies, they took the ideas, the idea of Satgur, for example, was I don't want to use the word created, but came to be in relation to anti-casteism of these Bahujan and Dalit poets and and thinkers. And so our Satpanth tradition is anti-casteist, and the liberation theology of that Satpanth, in terms of caste, race, I'll talk about Tawheed later on. All of this, I mean, it's so rich, right? So to go back to these texts and study them, and of course, Dr. Ali Asani has written some of this, I'm sure others have too that I don't know about. I do want to say this, and I'll end with these 2 quick points, and I'm sorry for taking up so much time, but Yasmin is an expert on everything, so I have totally told her to talk, but I'll take notes from her. But 2 important things are that for South Asians to think about anti-Blackness, it necessarily has to happen through caste, right? You cannot talk about anti-Blackness. You cannot stand in protest movements for Black Lives Matter. You cannot be in solidarity with Indigenous movements without confronting caste. Even if you do not know your caste, you do not know your place, you have to learn that caste is a structure of oppression. How does that play out into, and as a Pakistani, I know that I grew up hearing things like, ye Makrani hai, this person is Makrani, or all of that, right? Which are the Black people of Pakistan, who are Shittis, and like the whole understanding of caste and indigeneity. I didn't have that growing up. So that's why I'm offering this as something that we should look into. And the second thing I want to say is that, and I say this to my Brahmin colleagues who work with me on initiatives such as Cops of Campus all the time, so much so that I think now I've been blocked out of meetings and I don't get, meeting invites anymore, not that I want to be there anyways, are is this thing that caste is one of the oldest forms of carceration, right? Anti-Blackness is there, anti-indigeneity is there, but caste was one of the first structures of incarceration. If you cannot begin there as South Asians, it's just not that ethical for us to show up for BLM and solidarity movements with Indigenous peoples. We have to begin with caste. I'm so sorry for taking up so much time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Don't apologize. No, I think it's brilliant, and I'm sitting here listening to you, and mind you, I've been talking to Shaista and Yasmin for a couple of days now, and I just keep learning new things. So thank you both so far for sharing what you have. And what I'm really understanding from what you both have sort of shared is Yasmin talked a bit more about the origins essentially of intersectionality, Black feminist theory, and here's Shaista talking about caste and South Asian communities and how intersectionality sort of fits into, I mean, it has to fit into both if we're going to nuance our conversations around power, about hierarchies of power. And I think that from hearing this, and both of you, either one of you, Yasmin or Shaista, can speak to this, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about hierarchies of power and the layers that exist. And of course, I think the one thing that, whether it's caste or race, we look at is colonialism and how that shaped a lot of power and structures of inequities and things like that. So if you could elaborate a bit more on hierarchies of power and sort of what that does in this conversation.
Sure. Shaista, thanks so much. That was amazing. Especially in terms of, it really provides a huge and I think complex picture of how power hierarchies are operating in each one of those instances. But also, and I'm going to go off into another track, it also brought together the whole sort of like, or in fact, superimposed or aligned the whole hierarchy around colorism that's there. And I think, I mean, this is the whole thing about like how we think about Blackness, how we think about darkness compared to lightness, and the language that goes with it. And those such coded words that basically, infuse in us our own sort of sense of valuations around beauty, acceptability, nobility, all of those things, right? And how our own communities have sort of like perpetuated a particular sort of hierarchy around that color, the color hierarchy. But I want to go back to the notion of the power hierarchies that are there in casteism and in racism, because this is where I think the intersectionality allows us not only, like Shaista, you were saying, to embrace and to really appreciate the ways in which power travels downward, but also across. But also in terms of, I think it really allows us to appreciate our own sense of complicity in upholding a system. Because wherever we are in that system, whether we're at in the middle or at the top or at the bottom, we are still involved in maintaining that system. And I think this is where the sort of notion of penalties and privileges comes in. And I want to go back to something that Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the sort of persons who coined intersectionality, talks about this idea that of the analogy being the basement. We're all in this basement, and that we're all sort of layered one on top of the other, depending on what we have, and how those that are at the top are trying to get out of this hatch. And the closer they are to the people outside, the more likely they are to be getting out. But they also oppress, because they get their sense of difference and benefit from the ones that they are oppressing at the bottom. So it's that issue of the complicity that's there that I think, Shaista, your example really pointed out. How are we being complicit in the ways in which we other different communities within our community, right? And what is it based on? It's based on this kind of like, what is the genealogy around the name? How beautiful is this person? How fair are they? This has always been the criteria. And I think it's this sort of like the ways in which these very systems, the color hierarchy kind of forms an affinity with other systems of power. And that gives it more sort of like a more grease in a way to produce and reproduce over time. So I think that that's one thing. But I think the other thing is looking at it from the perspective of power. One of the things is that, and this is something that I've often referred to even in my work, is if we were to think about a whole system of power, then clearly the ones at the top are maintaining power. But how do they keep that hegemony going on? How do they convince those people that are below that, hey, it's in your interest to keep this power as well? Well, one way is through assimilation, right? The more, like if you think about the colonial example, then it's like you get the indigenous people at the bottom, and you have the Indians, like in East Africa, that were used as a middleman minority, as a buffer zone between the colonizers and the colonized. So it was very easy for the British to turn around and say, oh, you know, what's happening to the Africans is not because of us. It's happening because of the Indians. So go after the Indians. And the Indians say, well, we're more English or more British than the Africans. So we're more acceptable and more, you know, we could assimilate better. So I think that's one of the things where we look at this issue of complicity. What are the penalties and privileges that come across at each level, which allow us to maintain a system of power that is fundamentally unequal? So I think that that's one part of it. And I think the second part of it is that in that whole process, this middle, because we are in the US, all brown people seem to be, especially Indians, a middleman minority, like the example of the minorities that have made it. But in that process, how are we upholding, by being sandwiched in between, maintaining the power of the bookending, basically less power on one side and more power on the other side. So we're also complicit in maintaining that. And I think that that's another thing that we need to look at. If we are to form genuine bonds of solidarity and work with oppressed groups, we need to go back to our own experiences of that oppression. That's one thing. But the second thing is, what are the shared areas, not just of oppression, but what is our complicity in maintaining the system of power?
Yeah, absolutely. And Shaista, if you wanted to speak to a few points on that as well, thank you, Yasmin. And even like kind of taking us a little further about how and why faith communities then, as Yasmin mentioned, the sandwiching and the model minority that exists in our country and really worldwide as a result of colonialism and, you know, perpetuated through that. If you could even speak to a bit more about why does it matter for faith communities? Why should we care about this? And how are we to be aware of the power and privileges that exist in this hierarchy?
Shaista, you want to?
No, please, Yasmin, go ahead, and I'll just chip in a few points later.
Well, I think for me, is what kind of society do we want? What are the kinds of values that our faith communities and a lot of faith communities actually hold in common? You know, which is us striving for a better society. What is our role in this world as stewards of the world? What do we have in common with indigeneity, for instance, in terms of sharing a resource, but also in terms of our own complicity as superimposing ourselves, you know, as settlers on indigenous lands. So I think it's recognizing that self-responsibility, but ultimately one has to ask oneself, why give up the power one has? And unless there is an aim, unless there is a vision of a better society, unless there is a commitment to humanity, you know, that's not going to happen. And this is one of the fundamentals of our faith and of a lot of faiths, in fact, is to embrace that humanity, is to leave the world in a better place than when we came in. And this, I think, is an obligation on all of us, Muslims and other, as inhabitants of this world.
I also want to say that, to the point that Yasmin brought us to, that Islam has always been a protest religion, right? Islam was the first Muslims who came to this continent, were in the holds of slave ships. They were in chains. They were the Black people who were stolen. Well, they were the Africans who were stolen and made into Black peoples on this continent. So Islam has always been a protest religion. And of course, for us Shia Ismailis, the example of Karbala, it can be, the example of Karbala can be, for lack of a better word, like an epistemology, to how we orient ourselves to see the world, right? Imam Hussein was not fighting Yazid, at Karbala only for, for dominance or for establishing his own kingdom. He was fighting because, because Yazid was a womanizer, Yazid was all these things, but also because he wanted to bring the ethics taught by Prophet Muhammad back to Islam as it circulated at that time. So I think for us, given the example of Karbala, given long histories that are documented by by Black scholars, particularly on how everybody goes to Malcolm X, but even before Malcolm X, there are so many examples that we can study. Then we have works of people like Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, who've done an anti-patriarchal reinterpretation, reading of the Quran. And so, we have all these texts. So to even ask, like, why should faith communities care? I understand where that question is coming from, but we need to move away from that question. People who buy property, those of us Ismailis who become model minorities, not just through separation from Blackness, but also from caste, right? From Dalit Bahujans, right? Like we need to stop and think about what is it that we are doing? Why is our aim, to buy one more? I have people in my extended family who've said to me in their 20s, my goal is to earn $1 million of my own. And I'm like, why? It's so much more fun to have only $400 in your account and be able to do something that makes you think, okay, maybe my life is making some difference. So, not to get too polemical, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you both. And I think this conversation sort of takes a turn from not just looking at a theoretical concept of intersectionality, but really using that to understand where we are in our lives as individuals, as communities, because as you mentioned before, intersectionality is just that. It's nuance for the unique, right? It's the uniqueness that is you. It has a lot of context and things. And so I wanted to sort of take this conversation. I know time is something that I'm trying to keep an eye on as well, but there's just so much I want to ask. Shaista, I was wondering if you could quickly hint on, you had mentioned Tawheed and you said you were going to talk about it a bit more. So I wanted to see if you could quickly kind of recap how these ideas of race, intersectionality, caste, how they resonate with our faith and in reducing these types of inequities. And perhaps even the buzzword that we as Ismailis often use, pluralism.
Thank you, Heena. I was going to talk about Conference of the Birds, but then I realized that was such a stereotype, so I'll stay away from that. But very quickly, concept of Tawheed, which means oneness of God. I've been thinking about it in my own work. What would it mean to adopt Tawheed as an anti-racist praxis in my scholarship, in my political life, in my everyday life, right? As an ethical way of living in this world. As a scholar who writes about anti-Blackness, who writes about caste, who's done previous work on Indigenous solidarity, I have always rejected this idea of the human, which is not, I'm saying human with a capital H, which was formed as a particular kind of category post 1492. Only people who can fit into that category are, people from particular class. And I'm very much simplifying this, but the basic idea is that, only particular kinds of races, so white people, having certain kinds of, property owning, having particular kinds of being part of particular kinds of communities, only they can claim to be human. The rest of us are non-humans. In fact, there was a category in New York that Black scholar Sylvia Winters has written about, and I can send that article later on to people here as well, if they're interested. There used to be a category called NHE, not human enough. And that was a category used for Black people. So they would say 5 NHEs were shot. That means 5 people were shot. This is in 1990s. So I'm not even talking, well, for young people here, that might be centuries ago. For us, it's like 1990s, right? Like a few years ago. And so, this idea that, Black people can never be human enough, Dalit Bahujans can never be human enough. And I would say in today's world, no Muslim can be human enough. Well, yeah. And when I was confronted with this idea of Tawheed, which necessarily means that the unity of God must translate into unity of humanity, I was challenged quite a bit about what is it that I'm rejecting? What is it that I want to hold on to in these arguments, right? Like, is it enough to say, I don't want to be claimed as human? I don't want your recognition. I still don't want the recognition of the dominant communities as human enough, right? But to still fight for that place, to say that this is, but to fight for that humanity in ways that I probably failed to conceptualize, because 1492 has given me my categories of knowledge, race, caste, gender, sexuality. These are not the ways in which people interacted with each other. So what does it mean then? I mean, I'm still thinking through this. So I just put this idea forth. And Amina Wadud has written about this, and I would really refer the Jamaat to her book, Inside the Gender Jihad. And so she takes up this concept of Tawheed as a practice, and I'm still engaging with her work. So I'm not being very articulate, but I'll leave it at that, because I think the questions that we ask are sometimes so much more important than the answers we think we are working towards. So let's ask these questions.
Thank you, Shaista. And I think this kind of leads us to sort of our last point of discussion, perhaps, for this session. And Yasmin, I'm going to turn to you for this, because you sort of talked about it before, about learning from our history and things. But Shaista is talking about, going out there, doing your research, reading, and things like that. So how do you recommend we resist perpetuating these structures into ways of being, right? Where do we go from here? What do you recommend we do to address these issues of marginalization in our community and outside of our community?
Well, I think we need to, the role of the intellect is really, really critical in our faith, right? It's that intellect, the sharpness of the intellect, that allows us to see something, and to see it from the point of view of how, in fact, it's being used against us as well. How knowledge equals power, but how that kind of power is also used against us. And I think this is where, I mean, some of the things that Dr. Patel has pointed out, for instance, the rich tradition that's there in the Ginans, the protest tradition that's there, the fact that Islam began as a religion of equality, has always embraced equality. I think starting off from that, but I think the other thing is to also use the intellect to be aware of how classism and casteism and colorism really shape our communities. So the history allows us to be aware, for instance, of how class, going up the class by acquiring material possessions and money, has protected us in a way. It was there to protect us. It's very different. Like, for instance, if I take the bus, the kind of discrimination that's leveled at me, the violence of racism that I experience is really different than if I'm in a car, where I'm contained, where I can lock the doors, where I can still drive away. There's more of a latitude than when I'm in a bus. So classes protected us. And I think this is one of the reasons why, when I think about the history of Takia, of us going underground, was always having the trappings outside, but hiding the tariqa, the path within. And I think this is something that we can come to and learn about, which is, okay, we've used this in the past, but at the same time, it's like what the Imam has said, that when you start to amass this wealth for yourself, that's not what it's there for. It's there to be shared. It's there to put out in the community. And that means dismantling those structures that keep the hierarchies of power, in place. It means, in fact, going above and beyond and saying, you know what? My great grandmother might have been a Dalit that converted. they converted to get away from that kind of caste oppression. Why are we now in a position where we want to perpetuate that in the worlds that we're living in by engaging in anti-indigeneity, anti-Black racism, and so forth, right? How is it that we cannot begin to realize that what pluralism actually means is not a depoliticization of diversity, which is how it tends to be used, but a real appreciation of difference as difference. And I think that's the difference within our communities, which is that we're not all the same. I'm an Ismaili who lives in Canada, who has a very different history than an Ismaili who lives in Pakistan or in Iraq or anywhere else. It's never going to be the same, but that's not what we want, right? We don't want the sameness. We want to be able to appreciate the difference without using different as a source of power. And I think this is where it really, like, we have to go there if we are to live as real Muslims in this world.
Oh, thank you, Yasmin, for those kind of almost concluding, reflecting thoughts, right? And for both of you, Shaista and Yasmin, for being here and sharing your expertise and this discussion we've sort of had about what I'm getting from is the idea of repoliticizing these concepts, essentially, right? To depoliticize them would only make it would be a reductionist approach in some ways, it seems. And to really not emulate the knowledge structures from those in power, but to relearn, to add to our understanding, intellect, knowledge. And at the very end, really just acknowledging our own privileges, where we're coming from, and our histories, and doing something about it then. Because if we don't do something, we're essentially complicit to the inequities that exist and perpetuating these. So again, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I know that me, along with all the participants that we have on this call, could probably sit here for another hour and listen to you both. But I will keep everybody's time in mind to say, with everything that's been spoken here, the audience has been quite engaged and so many questions have come through. So we'd love to hear your insights upon maybe one or two of these questions, if that's okay. I'll turn to one of our first questions. As our faith leads us to stop oppression and slavery in all its forms, what actions are incumbent upon us as Muslims to combat caste structures? I know you touched upon it, but this is a question from the audience if you either of you want to elaborate.
Can you repeat that question again, please?
I'll repeat it a little slower. As our faith leads us to stop oppression and slavery in all of its forms, what actions are incumbent upon us as Muslims to combat caste structures?
Yasmin, I'll begin, and with my thoughts, because I would say that education is really important. Begin to read. I have sent in some resources that Farhana will share on the chat thingy. So begin with education. Start to ask questions. It's so much. If you do not know your caste histories, that's totally fine, because it has been erased on purpose. There's a deliberate erasure. But also know that Dalits, I would say in particular, in case of California, there's this big, what do you call it, landlord, Reddy. His last name is Reddy, who up until a few years ago was sex trafficking Dalit girls, bringing them to daytime. They would stand in his restaurant, and we've protested, nothing has happened, So and then of course he stopped because one of the young girls died. But begin to pay attention to the work of caste. Begin to understand that caste supremacy exists. There are Ismaili surnames now in our present Jamaat that are Kachra, which necessarily translates into garbage. There are Ismaili surnames Asura, which means demon, which is a reference to Ravan, right? Who Dalits revere and respect as anti-Ram. So begin to ask questions like, where are we coming from? How did we become Patel? I am not Patel by this is our adopted last name, which we were able to get rid of our last name through movement in South Asia. ask questions, ask questions from your, from your grandparents if you still have the privilege of accessing that information. But I think knowledge is really important, and begin especially like, and I can also send like, long lists of how to approach anti-Blackness through the lens of caste and casteism. I think that is really, educating ourselves is really important. I've been a casteist and anti-Black person almost my whole life, up until I came to grad school and began to understand things, right? It's okay to say that I'm learning. It's okay to say that I did this really, really bad thing today, but tomorrow I'll do better. I think it's also getting rid of our ego, which Islam teaches us, which our Imam teaches us. Look at his humility. I mean, so how can we have that ego? I'll stop there. Yasmin.
Okay, I just want to add 2 points to that brilliant discourse, Shaista. One of them is that I think we need to start off the point with a perspective, especially as Ismailis, that we're not innocent. There's a tendency to always think of ourselves as the victims that have been done to. We are not innocent. In maintaining hierarchies of power, we have benefited from that as well. It's very easy, and this is where the process of racialization comes in as a process, because race is made. It's constructed. It's a social construction. So in the US, in fact, there's a very interesting analysis of how the Irish became white, because the Irish were Black, were considered to be part of a Black race. But in that process of sort of like buying into a hierarchy that privileged them, that privileged certain things, they were whitened along the way. In the same way as Ismailis, I think we need to ask ourselves, how have we benefited from maintaining these structures of power? So how, and in that process of benefiting, how are we now contributing to the maintenance of that? So I think that's the second part of it. But as a process of racialization, that means that we can actually stop that. We don't need to be victims of it. We don't need to be victimized by it. We can certainly begin to question it, interrogate it, and say, no, that's not how it's going to be. So I think that there's that other side to it.
Thank you, Yasmin and Shaista, for really taking it and making it personalized for the community and the audience that's here. And also, having a little bit of grace for us as individuals. Like, for ourselves, we need to forgive and know that we're also learning, but not to use that as the cop-out to not continue to learn and be complicit in the oppressions and in these power structures. So thank you for beautifully putting those thoughts together for this question. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second question. This is a bit long, so I'll repeat it if you need it. Intersectionality requires acknowledging each individual's unique context, background, and experience. But many of the recent movements, including BLM, have suppressed objectives of many of the groups that comprise allies, including transgender communities. Do you have a view on how one could achieve gains as a movement without essentializing the differences? Are we good? Do you want me to repeat it?
No, I think, let me try and take a stab at this. It's true that, in fact, there's a tendency for that race essentialism to basically block the kind of solidarities that are there, but also the alliance building. I think one of the things is intersectionality really teaches us that we're not the same. Okay, if we take that as a point of departure, I can empathize certainly with the pain of others, but that doesn't mean to say that I've experienced the same pain. So I think this is really important, because when I'm thinking about, say, for instance, violence against women, I can't say that I've experienced that, but I can empathize with it, seeing racism as a form of violence. But that doesn't make me sort of like, I can't take the place of a woman who's been battered. I'm not going to do that. I have to maintain that distance and wait for that woman to say to me, okay, I want you to be an ally. I think that's one of the first things. The second thing is strategic essentialism, as Gayatri Spivak has pointed out, is really important in terms of movement building. So if we have movements that are fragmented, that have all kinds of sort of elements in there, it's very easy for the powers that be to break that apart. by buying in different portions of it and teasing, different components with like rewards. Hey, you come onto my side. Or even, for instance, the idea of anger. We think about anger as something that is like hegemonic movements or movements that are in power always say you have to make your demands in the language of reason in order to be heard. But how much of that are we trading in of ourselves, of what we really feel, by putting that in the language of reason? So when we think about movements like Black Lives Matter, with the accumulated grief basically that's there, but the pain and the suffering of decades, hundreds of years, how do you come along and say, I have the best interest at heart and I really would like to help you, right? You, it's not going to go anywhere. You're facing a whole other element there. And I think it's up to that group to then turn around and say, well, you can be allies. You work with us like this. So if I look at the women's movement, one of the ways that they've said to men is, yes, you can be allies. You can raise the funds for us to do the work we're doing, not necessarily being there as counselors. So I think there are parallel situations here. And the thing is, the way in which the systems of power work is they're constantly drawing in, and making us complicit by dangling rewards in front of us. If you speak in the language of reason, you will be heard. If you are heard, you will listen to our side of the story, as opposed to like rage. This is, I think, one of the biggest issues, because it's like you have to have strategic essentialism in order for a movement to make its stance. But at the same time, people in that movement can then, over a period of time, turn to you and say, this is how you want to be an ally, do this for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Shaista, did you want to add anything to that?
One thing. I just thank you, Yasmin, for that. I just want to say, and I'll say this especially to young people: do not make heroes. Do not put anyone on a pedestal. I mean, except for Imam and Prophet and our peers. But like, do not make heroes, because often what we do is when we I'm going to use a very ableist word. I apologize because I can't think of another one right now. But when we blindly follow somebody, they fall flat on their faces, and along with them, we also fall flat on our faces, right? Just because Black Lives Matter is a movement for liberation of Black peoples, it doesn't mean that there is no transphobia in that movement. It doesn't mean there has not been cases of sexual assaults against particular kinds of cis women and non-binary people in the movement. We are, when I said 1492, we are all taught to accept knowledges in a particular way, right? So just because you're Black doesn't mean that you're also not taught anti-Blackness, that you also do not invest in anti-Blackness. So I'll say this: do not make heroes. Usually try and listen to women and non-binary people. We know better than cis men. And secondly, I would say, I was thinking of this example. Actually, I was teaching my grad students this just like a couple of weeks ago. Malcolm X, the great Malcolm X, changed his viewpoint on things once he began to read Audre Lorde. Nation of Islam, there are beautiful critiques of sexism and patriarchy Nation of Islam, which did such important work. We cannot, do not reject people, do not embrace people so tight that you cannot see them, right? This is what I'll say, and I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. And I think that speaks to what Yasmin was talking about as well, right? Is to learn about what the communities want and let them wait for them, right? And you mentioned a bit about the ego as well. Often we go in wanting to do good for others. And while it's a beautiful thought, it can be a bit dangerous in how we approach it. So I do thank you both for addressing how to perhaps add more context to the movements that we are looking at, or perhaps part of, or what have you. And I think this leads to our last and final question that I'll try to, have you both give your insights on, because it connects to this a bit, if I'm not mistaken. Again, this is a bit long, so I'll go slow. Thinking about what both speakers have talked about, you both, about that outline relative privilege, where in some spaces we might have shared experiences of oppression, but also power, where in some places we are complicit even without meaning to, meaning to be or wanting to be? How do we think about the dissonance of building alliances and working to deconstruct oppression while being complicit because of the other identities that play into it? Do you want me to repeat it, or are we good?
It's a really convoluted question because there's so many layers to it and it's very nuanced and complex. How do we think about the dissonance of building alliances and working to deconstruct while being complicit because of other identities that play into it? I'm thinking here of, and Shaista, please jump in. I'm thinking here of how do we, if you are at, say, for instance, a pinnacle of privilege in our community, you're able-bodied male, heterosexual, upper class, fair, you can think, I can think of all these attributes, well-educated, and so forth. Then how would you think about like building alliances? That would be one thing, and deconstructing oppression. I think one of the things is interrogating one's own place in that is a really important place to start. Where am I located in this structure, and how am I benefiting from that? But also, where is my agency? I think one of the big things is that when we think about privileges and penalties that are there at every level, we have to think about those privileges in terms of what am I able to do, right? Where is my agency? I have access to money. I have access to credibility. I have access to power. How then do I make these possible? How do I empower others so that they can then engage in the work that needs to be done to dismantle these hierarchies of power? That piece, I think, really places, especially many of us in this community, from a particular tradition, who are in this class, who can really do this work and have been doing it kind of in different ways by supporting foundations and so forth. But also, how do we do it at the local level as opposed to just internationally, just going for the supporting this foundation or that foundation, but really looking at what are the local needs in this community and where can I, with the power, with the privileges I have of not only being able-bodied, but being able to speak in the dominant language, being able to command or even translate that notion of rage into the language of reason that is going to be heard. How can I make that voice count? So I think at each step there is, you can work at it, but it starts with that kind of interrogation.
Yasmin, thank you so much. Thank you. I was like clapping at one point. Thank you. I'll just say this, I'll leave with this. There are two kinds of complicity or two ways of looking at complicity. One is situational. I've come to this country. I gave well, I'm Canadian, so I'll put it in that context. I gave my oath to the Queen, raised my hand and then said like, whatever, I accept her sovereignty. And then there's the willful complicity. I am going to make $1 million by this day or age, whatever, right? I mean, we can think of things and to build an otherwise world, and Black feminists, Indigenous feminists, increasingly Dalit feminists, read works by, I've added resources, begin with reading Babasaheb Ambedkar, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, read, my sister, Thenmuri Sundarajan, who does so much work, who's Dalit, does so much work on caste supremacy. So, at least learn where you can, guard your ambitions, where you can channel your energies, your resources into doing something, into doing things otherwise, right? And I was going to give an example, but I can't remember right now because of pandemic brains. But I'll just say this, that there is situational complicity, and even situational complicity. What would it mean? And I'm going to say this. For a long time, I've been, in different. I used to do a lot of solidarity work with Haudenosaunee peoples who are, Indigenous peoples located outside of Toronto, the city that I come from, and we used to talk about. I used to listen to clan mothers, listen to elders. Not all elders are worth listening to. I'll also say this, listen to the good ones. And we used to talk about what would it mean to end Canada, right? I want to come back to Canada, so I'll whisper this, but like, what does it mean to end Canada? What does it mean to think of, grounded Indigenous sovereignty, not the masculinist version, right? But sovereignty of the body, sovereignty of the spiritual, which so is in conversation with Dalit feminist epistemologies as well. I think we can do this. We can do this. There's hope, but we just have to figure out, we have to sit with people who matter to us, with whom we want to be in solidarity, people who do not necessarily look like us, but on the inside feel like us. So I don't know if that answers anything, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it does actually, and I think both of you, Shaista and Yasmin, have sort of left us with these thoughts of, as individuals who have now come on a Sunday to listen to this topic, we, again, like I said before, it's not just the theoretical, but what do we do about it? And I think both of you have left us with enough mediums and ways to sort of, at least at the very least, start the introspection and that reflective process on where we fit into all of this. And I think it's quite important for us as individuals to start there and see where we need to forgive ourselves, where we need to learn from others. How do we exit our echo chambers and learn from those who think differently from us as well, in order to dismantle structures of power that lead to inequalities and inequities and violence and all of the things that we've been discussing and hearing about today. So I wanted to thank you both again, Dr. Shaista Abdul Aziz Patel and Dr. Yasmin Jiwani, for being with us here today. It was just wonderful. And I mean, I'm going to be bothering you guys again in the future, but it was wonderful to hear from you both. Thank you, audience, for joining us today, taking time out on a Sunday to be with us and engaging in this discussion and not just sitting there and listening, right? There's so much back and forth in the chat boxes as well. It's wonderful to see the questions. Hopefully, this is just a start to the critical conversation. And I say this because it's not a hopefully. You both have literally left us with questions to continue thinking about. So I hope that we can continue to think about these topics and conversations. Like I said, today was a treat for me, as I hope it was for all that are watching. Thank you again. A couple of announcements before everybody leaves the chat. In the chat box, Farhana has included the list of resources that the panelists have sort of shared with us. Please look out for more information on the.ismaili/USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and our next critical conversation. And lastly, please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. With that, I wish you well, safety, thank you, and Yali Madad.